Welcome to episode negative 3B of Successful Demo. In each episode, I'll analyze the theoretical and practical aspects of one or more existing cards. Today's card of the day is House of Knives. So, this is a card that can damage the runner only during a run. However, it takes place during a paid ability window. For those of you viewers who are less familiar with the technical terms of Netrunner, a paid ability is an ability on a card that is phrased as cost:effect. Such an ability is called a paid ability because it can only be fired during paid ability windows. Typically, this means in between clicks, but also it also refers to certain junctures during a run. These happen fairly often, making House of Knives a pretty powerful card. But can you think, for those of you who are more familiar with the card pool, can you think of other corp cards that damage the runner during paid ability windows? There are several of them, but let's see how many you can get. So put on your thinking caps and pause the video if need be. We'll review the answers shortly. Okay, have you thought about it yet? They are Rion Knight, Self-Destruct, and Victor 2.0. As far as I know, these are the only corp cards that deal damage during paid ability windows. Now, if you want to compare them in terms of power level, House of Knives is head and shoulders better than all of these. Why is that? Well, Victor 2.0 is the most flexible of them all. The one brain damage is not restricted to a run. You can fire it anytime you like. However, in order to get that power counter in the first place, you need the subroutines of Victor 2 to fire, and on top of that, you need to beat the runner in a trace. So this makes it a very conditional card. You can say the same for Rion Knight and Self-Destruct, the former requiring the runner to run on the correct server on their last click, and the latter requiring the runner to lose a trace plus have the corp destroy the entire server. So because of this, House of Knives is generally the most flexible of the lot, and not to mention that you get three tries at it because you get 3 agenda counters on House of Knives, whereas the others are generally only single use. So that makes House of Knives pretty good, but some of you might still be asking, what's the significance of dealing damage during a paid ability window? Well, let's compare it to another Jinteki card in Ronin. Now, these both cards seem mechanically similar in that they deal 3 total net damage, but functionally they are very different. Ronin requires a click to fire, meaning that it can only fire on the corp's turn. Thus, the runner doesn't need to worry about the damage until the end of their turn, when they pass the turn over to the corp. Only then do they need to worry about beating the safety threshold of having at least 3 cards in hand to survive a Ronin. Whereas with House of Knives, because it doesn't require a click, because it's on a paid ability window, as long as the runner is eligible to be targeted by House of Knives, they have to worry about the number of cards in their hand, which is basically almost at every single point during the run. The only upshot for the runner is that House of Knives can only be used once per run. Therefore, the amount of damage is limited to 1 damage per run, so their safety threshold is higher rather. They only need 1 card in hand instead of 3 for Ronin. Still, House of Knives is very threatening because it can threaten the runner at so many points during the game. Every single run, they have to be mindful of the House of Knives, whereas with Ronin, it's only at the end of each turn. And this has several implications as well, because during runs, you typically meet other cards that deal net damage, not just House of Knives. In a Jinteki deck, for example, which is where you'll be playing this agenda anyway, you need to be running with 1 more card than usual. If you want to survive a snare at the end of a run, you need to start the run with at least 4 cards in your grip. Because snare deals 3 net damage and House of Knives may fire, bringing up the total damage to 4, you need 4 to survive. Same thing with Obokata Protocol. You need 5 cards in grip instead of 4 if you want to be able to steal it. So by increasing this threshold, it makes it such that the runner has to play a lot more passively, and they will have to overdraw as a result. And this is very beneficial for the corp. We'll explain later why. And this threat is not just a one-off threat. Unlike those trash can cards like Rion Knight and Self-Destruct, House of Knives persists till the end of the game, or at least until it runs out of tokens. Therefore, the co-op should be judicious when using House of Knives tokens. You always want to have at least one token on House of Knives to force the runner into playing extra cautious throughout the entire game, which will hinder the gameplay. Okay. So as mentioned earlier, this card was suggested by Andrew R, who, I quote, states that it's a potentially powerful effect that is fairly easy to score in faction, and that's definitely true. As a 3 advanceable agenda, it can be snuck out onto the board unadvanced. If the runner doesn't check it, you can score it. Alternatively, you can fast advance it from hand. So yeah, it's not a difficult agenda to score at all. However, it needs to be part of a particular deck to get its best value. Right now in the game, where does House of Knives sit, particularly given all the options available in the card pool for net damage protection? That's a very good question that we'll address shortly, but first, it is important to note that I agree with Andrew on House of Knives having the best card art in the entire game. Ever since this card was spoiled and released back in the day, I was so hoping that FFG would make an official House of Knives playmat. You know, if I didn't win a set playmat at the correct tournament, I would simply just buy it off the internet. That's how much I want a custom House of Knives playmat. The card art is just amazing, and I would love to bring it to the table every time. It's very Netrunner, and the art is amazing. So, regarding net damage protection, here are some of the common options available. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but they can generally be split into 2 categories. The left category are protection options that are persistent, meaning that they stick on the table throughout the entire game, however at the cost of being expensive to use. 3 credits per net damage is a steep price to pay, and that's something we can exploit with House of Knives. The other category on the right are single-use protection cards that block a big chunk of damage. House of Knives is particularly good against these damage protection sources because House of Knives deals 3 instances of 1 damage. So these cards can only protect 1 of the 3 instances at most, meaning that House of Knives will still have some effect on the runner even if they play such cards. So as House of Knives, you really only need to worry about those persistent damage protection sources. So how would you deck build and play given all this knowledge? So after reviewing everything, we know that House of Knives is a very nice card to trip up unskilled / careless runners. As mentioned earlier, if they run with too few cards in hand to survive a snare or an obocarter, you can exploit this with House of Knives. And the same goes for runners that don't have protection. If they don't have net damage protection, it's potentially a very cheap way to score an easy game win. Now, some runners do have protection, and as with all net damage cards, you have to ensure that your deck is built such that it's robust, such that you are not completely you don't have all your eggs in one basket, in this House of Knives basket. You need to have a way to achieve an alternate win condition, typically with agenda points, which House of Knives helps you with. You know, when you score it, you still gain 1 agenda point. It's not a lot, but it's something. And more importantly, it gives you a scored agenda effect that can help you score future agendas. You could potentially protect your obocarters, future obocarters with it, or you can simply slow the runner down by forcing them to spend money to defend against this net damage. As mentioned, 3 credits per net damage is a lot. That's 9 credits that the runner can potentially lose when you score a House of Knives. These 9 credits could be spent instead on breaking remote ice that you try to score other agendas behind. So all in all, if you have a way to, take advantage of this net damage and speed up further ahead in tempo than the runner, you're in a good place, and I think House of Knives will serve you very well. Here is a screenshot from the game that we featured in the previous episode, -3A, sorry. On my second House of Knives usage, my opponent playing Max was dirty laundering R&D, and they only had 3 cards in hand. Now, if you remember, my Mti Waikundu deck does run snares in it, so This was a prime opportunity to fire House of Knives to bring them down to 2 cards in hand, exposing them to the risk of snare. While ultimately they did not access the snare of R&D is randomized after all, but House of Knives opens up such opportunities for you to trip up runners who run with just too few cards in hand. You push them you just basically push them right into the threshold of getting killed. It's important to note that being judicious with House of Knives is the difference between winning and losing games. Typically, you won't want to use House of Knives as the corp when it doesn't really have an impact on the runner. For example, if they run with lots of cards in hand, 6 or more cards, there's no point in using House of Knives because they will almost certainly survive the run anyway, and chances are they will have to discard cards from their hand at the end of the turn anyway. So dealing net damage to them doesn't really do much when they have a lot of hit points or cards in hand. Conversely, if they are on the brink of flatlining, like in this screenshot here, then that is a prime opportunity to expand your House of Knives tokens. Right, to remind everyone, this is the deck that we played the last time. It's the exact same deck that we're going to run again. If you remember, we were showcasing Brainstorm last time. Brainstorm and Komainu work very well with House of Knives because since runners are compelled to run with more cards in hand, when a House of Knives is scored, as I mentioned, they need to increase their safety threshold. This means that Komainu and Brainstorm will likely gain more subroutines because the runner starts the run with more cards in hand. So there's a very nice synergy right there that we're going to exploit in the upcoming game. Today we are up against James Gray's signature Kumalo. And we keep our opening hand because it has a good amount of ice in it, as well as an economy card in Maryland Campaign. Now typically you will ice HQ first thing against Kumalo simply because you don't want cards smashed from your hand. But given that all the cards in our hand have a play or res cost above 0 and they have no viruses on turn 1, we don't need to worry too much about HQ runs. So instead, we're going to ice R&D because there are more agendas in R&D than in HQ, and we are just going to wait. We're going to wait for our opponent to run and then lure them into a Cortex lock. Okay, they're not running. Fine. No Cortex lock for you. They put Black Orchestra and MK Ultra in the bin, so a lot of my painful ice is deactivated, and this is where I make my first mistake. I wasn't really paying attention to the fact that they actually have a bunch of breakers in their bin, so I attempt to score a Philotic Entanglement here. Now I could have put a Kakugo here, but they play Employee Strike, so whoops. I just fed my opponent a free Philotic Entanglement. Not the best start to the game at all. Right, so Maryland continues ticking down, and since Employee Strike is up, I'll now have to build a remote server the hard way. So I play Kakugo onto the remote. Usually you would keep the Kakugo in hand so that you can install it with Mti's ability, but without Mti's ability, because we are struck out, Kakugo now goes to the base of our server as we install it manually, while our opponent dirty laundries into HQ and sees Punitive Counter-Strike. So the jig is up there. But I then draw into a snare, which is really nice. I hope my opponent will continue running my hand early and often. This will be a very good time to have snare to fire. And we put more ice on the remote because we want Rashida to fire. The remote needs to be as big of a deterrence as possible. And indeed, our opponent spends the time setting up, so we get a Rashida fire. We draw into an agenda here, the House of Knives. So this is where the beauty of House of Knives comes in, because if your opponent doesn't know your deck list, the expectation is that you are running an agenda suite of 2 and 3 pointers. If you're running the Mti Kundu ID ability, people expect that you're running a Glacier deck, so they expect big agendas. But what they don't actually see coming is that you're actually running these small agendas that don't need to be advanced to score from the remote. As our opponent installs a Consume here, runs HQ and sees Punitive again, missing the snare in my hand, I score the House of Knives. Now the jig is up. They know that House of Knives is live and they could be in jeopardy. The other nice thing about House of Knives is that because it's not telegraphed, my opponent didn't bother running the remote because there were no advanced cards inside. I was able to score an agenda which got rid of my opponent's Employee Strike. So now they have to respect Employee Strike. My ID ability. For this reason, there are a lot less a lot more passive. They can't simply run HQ every turn because they have to worry about me just dropping a very nasty ice on their face. But now they don't have to worry about that anymore because they installed David, so that takes care of DNA trackers and Chiashis. With a Thimble Rig in my head, I'm wondering if I should install it using Mt's ability. I definitely could, and eventually I choose to do so because for a simple reason, if they do access the Thimble Rig in my hand and trash it with Imp, I'll be very sad. I'd rather install the Thimble Rig here and force them to install their Black Orchestra, which is a very inefficient breaker to deal with Thimble Rig. And then I use a House of Knives token here to get rid of one card, hoping they would hit a snare and go down to 0 cards in hand. Unfortunately, they hit a Punitive instead, so Punitive in the bin. I fire yet another Rashida, but this time do not draw into any agendas. So, not really sure what to do here. I have 3 whole clicks but nothing to do. I already have a Mumbat City Grid in the remote, so yeah. As far as I'm concerned, the remote's well and truly fortified. Their breakers are inefficient and I should be able to score agendas, but I'm not finding said agendas. So instead, I'm going to show up HQ by putting a Cortex Lock on it. The main reason here is I don't want my opponent farming Turning Wheel counters in case they do drop a Turning Wheel and begin running HQ and jacking out. Or rather ending the run with Thimble Rig. My second click I manually draw and I do find a House of Knives, so that immediately goes in my remote. Even though it's not worth a lot of points, having 2 House of Knives in play at once means that I can potentially deal 2 net damage in a single run, double the normal amount of 1 net damage from a single House of Knives, and that makes it really difficult to survive snares and oboe carters. So that was my objective, to score the House of Knives, but my opponent goes for the cheap easy way out. They're just gonna run R&D. The remote's too thick with a defensive upgrade, so why not just run the single ice R&D instead? Well, they ran into one of my most taxing ice in Komainu. MK Ultra doesn't like breaking Komainus at all, so my opponent let the entire Komainu fire, knowing full well that I've had worse would protect them and leave them with 3 hit points. But I can use House of Knives here to lower them to 2 hit points before the run is successful, and easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Now I want to do a freeze frame here to draw your attention to my opponent's stack. Now, sure, if they had played less recklessly, the game would have gone on and would actually have been an interesting game. But if you notice, I still had a bit of an edge over my opponent because they were running out of cards in their stack. They've been very liberal with letting this this bitey boy here fire, and as a result, my opponent just burned through their cards very quickly. So even if they had drawn 1 more card prior to this run, who's to say they're out of the woods? With only about 11 hit points left. And don't forget that this card here is a House of Knives that was about to score. I would have at least 4 more guaranteed net damage. 1 from the House of Knives here and 3 from here. And there's still a live snare in my hand. There's still a punitive counter strike to punish them if they steal an oboe carter, which would cost them 4 net damage plus another 3 with the punitive counter strike. You'll note that because they're running so low on cards, they have to use their money cards very sparingly, which means that my credit pool is almost certainly more than enough to overpower theirs with a punitive. So I could have won the game not by agendas, but by simply grinding out their stack. And this is exactly the power of House of Knives that I want to allude to. Not only does it score you a token 1 agenda point when you score it, not only does it force the runner to run with 1 extra card or risk dying like James Gray did, but more importantly, even if they take all these precautions and play safely, it still is able to provide you with a secondary win condition in grinding out your opponent's stack. And nowadays, that is very relevant because of the presence of the agenda Oboe Carter protocol. It's on the restricted list for a reason. If you deal enough net damage to the runner, they can't steal this agenda, meaning that you can install double advance this naked in the remote and they can't do jack about it. Well, I guess my opponent can. They have an imp and they have not carry. So that is one way to counter me, that's for sure. But still, they can't steal it. So that's a lot fewer agendas they have that are stealable for them. And of course, not to mention that Imp isn't able to get around snares, which there are still plentiful of between my hand and my stack. So yeah, definitely a game that would have been pretty tight had it gone on later on. But yeah, House of Knives just doing a lot of work whenever you score it. Even though it's not worth a lot of points, it can create some interesting alternate win conditions for you that you would never anticipate given the original deck. It's also worth mentioning that this card has a lot of combos and nombos to go with it. Let's start with the combos. We did mention that House of Knives works very well with Komainu simply because the runner will tend to encounter Komainu with more cards in the hand once House of Knives has tokens on it. However, what I didn't mention is that House of Knives basically forces the runner to break Komainu. Right? As you saw this game, my opponent was on one occasion my opponent let the Komainu fire for 5 net damage willingly, even though they had MK Ultra in the bin, and the reason was that they had I've had worse in hand, which allowed them to draw up after the 5 net damage. They would not have been able to survive the 5 net damage if they did not have the I've had worse, because with my House of Knives token I can deal the 6 net damage in order to flatline them. But the House of Knives kept them safe. It's just that right after letting the Komainu fire, the House of Knives dropped them to 2 hit points, and then they died to a conveniently top-decked snare. Fast Advance is a very good combo with House of Knives as well, because it allows you to push out this agenda without risking it being stolen from the remote. Having 3 advancement requirement means that you only need 1 fast advance card to do it, and Shipment from Tenin tends to be the card of choice because you are in the Jinteki faction and this is free of influence. And also worth mentioning is that House of Knives is an agenda that you want to proactively score because of its powerful effect, as we demonstrated in today's game. Next up, identities. House of Knives synergizes very well with Potatoes Unleashed because it converts the 3 net damage that this agenda can potentially deal into 6 net damage. Sorry, not net damage, sorry, 6 hit points of damage. It's important to make the distinction. It will still only do 3 net damage, but it will also, at the same time, mill 3 cards from the top of the stack for a total of 6 cards gone into the bin just like that. And for an identity whose objective is to put all your opponent's cards in the bin, House of Knives is a very valuable agenda in Potatoes Unleashed. Some people might even argue that House of Knives is an auto-include 3 off, just because it provides so much milling potential and because it is very reliable. All you need to do is to fast advance it. Shipment from Tenin very easily comes to mind here. Yeah, it's important to note that unlike other cards that deal 3 net damage like Ronin, the 3 net damage from House of Knives comes in 3 separate instances, so it triggers Potatoes Unleash 3 different times, whereas Ronin, which deals 3 net damage in 1 fell swoop, will only trigger Potatoes Unleash once. So that subtle difference there is what allows House of Knives to mill 6 cards instead of the typical 3 cards that a 3 net damage card would. Next up, this is not Potatoes Unleashed anymore, this is Potatoes Evolving. Personal Evolution also makes very good use of House of Knives. It turns 3 hit points of damage into 4 hit points of damage because of the ID ability that stacks on 1 additional net damage. So yeah, when you score it, it forces the runner to lose a lot of tempo. 4 net damage, that's like stealing an Obo Carter, except that they don't even get the 3 agenda points for doing so. Now, when House of Knives is stolen, not all hope is lost. For the runner, this House of Knives is worth a pathetic amount, 1 agenda point. This means that they have to steal a lot more agendas in order to win the game. And the more agendas they steal, the more net damage they'll take from your identity ability. So in short, House of Knives is good with Personal Evolution because it is beneficial both when the runner steals it and when you score it. It's a win-win situation for the corp. Now finally, we move on to the nombos. The most notable nombo of them all is House of Knives doesn't work very well with Psychic Field. There's no point in firing House of Knives before the runner accesses Psychic Field, simply because Psychic Field will reduce the runner's grip to nothing anyway. So that is just a waste of a House of Knives token. On the other hand, if you were to fire the House of Knives after Psychic Field, you would be cheating. A judge would come over and give you a game loss because there is no paid ability window to do so. Let me bring this up here. So you access the Psychic Field during the access phase, step 4.5. The runner accesses the card. This is when Psychic Field fires, when the side game is played, and when the runner potentially drops all the cards from their hand. As you notice, this is the symbol for paid ability window, this circular arrow here. You don't see any more circular arrows for the rest of the run. By the time you get to the end of the run, step 5, there is no circular arrow in between this phase, step 4.5, and step 5 when the run ends. And this means that there is simply no paid ability window in which to use House of Knives. There are paid ability windows after the run's over in between clicks, but House of Knives can only be used during the run. The run has ended, so you cannot kill the runner with a Psychic Field followed up by a House of Knives. So this is a non-ball. All that being said, playing both in the same deck isn't necessarily a wrong decision. Give me a moment here. Can I erase these pen markings? There we go. Playing both cards in the same deck is not necessarily a wrong choice. You might want to do so if you are playing a mill deck, like a Potatoes Unleashed deck for example. You want to get rid of all the cards in the runner's stack and their grip. Both cards deal significant amounts of net damage, so it might be worth playing both of them just for the lots of damage. But you wouldn't want to use a House of Knives during a Psychic Field run, that's for sure. Alright, that sound means we are out of time. So thanks very much to Andrew R for suggesting House of Knives. I hope that I've covered most of what you wanted me to cover. And as for the rest of you, thanks for watching as always, and happy net running. I'll see you next time. Bye!